Singapore is a city of 5.5 million people. It has more millionaires per capita than almost any other country on Earth. And the people at the very top of that concentration, the ones whose decisions move capital across continents, whose names appear in no publication, whose influence over markets and governments is genuinely significant, operate by a set of principles that have never been written down anywhere. Not because the principles are secret, because the people who use them prefer a world where you don't know they exist. Please subscribe and activate the button to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can bring you more relevant content and so YouTube can notify you when we publish new videos. Singapore was not supposed to survive. When Lee Kuan Yew stood before cameras in August 1965 and announced, with visible emotion, that Singapore had been separated from Malaysia and was now an independent nation, the prognosis from almost every serious analyst was grim. A city with no natural resources, no agricultural land, no military capable of defending its borders, surrounded by larger and at times hostile neighbors, with a population of less than 2 million people, divided by ethnicity, language, and religion. The conditions for failure were so comprehensively present that failure seemed not merely likely but structurally inevitable. What happened instead became the template for one of the most studied national transformations in modern history. Within a generation, Singapore had become one of the wealthiest nations on Earth per capita. Within 2 generations, it had positioned itself as the premier financial hub of Asia, the jurisdiction of choice for the most sophisticated capital flows in the region, the address selected by family offices and sovereign wealth funds and multinational corporations for the specific combination of legal reliability, political stability, and strategic geography that no competitor in the region could fully replicate. The transformation was not accidental. It was engineered, with a precision, patience, and a willingness to make decisions that were uncomfortable in the short term and structurally essential in the long term, that the Singapore model has never stopped exemplifying. And the billionaires who built their fortunes inside that model, who understood, early and completely, what Singapore was becoming and positioned themselves accordingly, absorbed something from the environment that their counterparts in louder financial centers never fully developed. The understanding that the most powerful position is almost always the least visible one. This is the first principle, and it runs through everything that follows. Singapore's elite did not build their wealth by being the most prominent figures in their industries. They built it by being the most precisely positioned, by occupying the specific nodes in the networks of capital, relationship, and information through which the significant transactions of the region flow, and by occupying those nodes so quietly, so completely, and so durably that the transactions became dependent on their presence without anyone outside the network ever fully mapping the dependency. In New York, the successful financier becomes a public figure. Their deals are covered, their opinions are solicited, their social lives are documented, and their philanthropy is announced. The visibility is part of the identity, part of the brand, part of the self-understanding of a culture that has always equated prominence with success. In Singapore, the equivalently successful financier is often genuinely unknown outside a circle of perhaps 200 people whose opinion is the only opinion that matters to the transactions being conducted. Their deals are not covered because they are structured to avoid the reporting thresholds that trigger coverage. Their opinions are not solicited publicly because they are delivered privately to the people making the decisions, in the specific form that private advice takes when it is actually listened to. Their philanthropy, when it exists, is directed through structures that do not require their name to appear anywhere a journalist would think to look. This is not evasion, it is a strategy. And the distinction matters because evasion is defensive, it is a response to a threat. What the Singapore elite practice is something more proactive. It is the deliberate construction of a position that generates no target, that produces no surface against which opposition can organize, no visibility against which regulation can orient, no prominence against which competition can aim. The most dangerous competitor in any market is the one you do not know is competing. Singapore's most successful billionaires understood this before they had the resources to fully act on it, and built everything, the structures, the relationships, the operating principles, the specific culture of their organizations, around the operational reality of that understanding. They are competing. Constantly. At a level of intensity that would surprise the people who assume that extreme wealth produces complacency. But the competition is invisible. conducted through proxies and structures and relationships that leave no obvious trace in any public record, producing outcomes that appear, to the casual observer, like the natural result of a well-governed financial center operating normally. The outcomes are not natural. They are the result of specific decisions made by specific people, using principles that the rest of the financial world has spent decades trying to partially reconstruct. The first of those principles is already visible in everything described above. In Singapore, silence is not the absence of strategy. Silence is the strategy. The family office is the primary instrument of serious wealth management in Singapore, and it is almost completely misunderstood by everyone outside the specific professional world that serves it. The misunderstanding begins with the name. The word family suggests domesticity, something warm, personal, oriented around the well-being of individual human beings rather than the mechanics of capital deployment. The word office suggests a location, a staff, an institutional structure. Together, they imply something that is perhaps professionally managed, but ultimately personal in its purpose and modest in its ambitions. Singapore's leading family offices are none of these things. They are investment vehicles of genuine institutional scale, operating with the strategic sophistication of the best hedge funds, the legal architecture of the most carefully structured private equity firms, and the informational advantages of organizations that have been building relationships in the region's most consequential financial and political circles for decades. And they do all of this without the reporting obligations, the regulatory oversight, or the public visibility that institutional investors of comparable scale are required to accept. A single family office managing $5 billion in Singapore operates in an environment of disclosure that would be unrecognizable to a fund manager operating a comparably sized vehicle in New York or London. The specific combination of Singapore's legal framework, its tax treaty network, its political stability, and its strategic position as the jurisdiction of choice for capital flows from across Southeast Asia, Greater China, and the Indian subcontinent creates conditions under which significant capital can be managed, deployed, and grown with a freedom of movement that mature Western financial markets have been systematically closing off for decades. The Singapore elite did not stumble into this advantage, they built it. Through sustained, patient, strategically coordinated engagement with the legal and regulatory frameworks that govern capital in the jurisdiction, engagement that has produced an environment specifically calibrated to attract exactly the kind of sophisticated, long-term, relationship-oriented capital management that the family office model represents. Here is the number that makes this concrete. Between 2018 and 2023, the number of single-family offices in Singapore more than quadrupled. This growth was not the organic product of market forces alone. It was the result of a deliberate policy environment, maintained with the specific intention of positioning Singapore as the preeminent family office jurisdiction in Asia, combined with a global political environment that was making the alternatives, Hong Kong, the traditional offshore centers of the Caribbean, and the Channel Islands, the European jurisdictions that had historically served this market, progressively less attractive for reasons that the Singapore authorities both anticipated and positioned to benefit from. The Singapore billionaire who has been inside this environment for 20 years did not simply benefit from the growth. They helped architect the conditions that produced it. Through the specific, relationship-based, long-horizon engagement with policymakers and regulatory frameworks that distinguishes serious wealth from successful wealth, the understanding that the rules of the game matter more, in the long run, than any individual play made within the current rules. They were building the next game while everyone else was focused on winning the current one. This is the second principle, and it is, in some ways, the most difficult to fully internalize, because it operates on a timeline that conflicts with every instinct that short-term commercial success reinforces. The Singapore elite think in decades, not as a platitude, not as a cultural generalization about Asian business culture, as a literal operational reality that governs how they allocate their most important resource, which is not capital but attention. The decisions that receive the most sustained attention are not the ones with the best near-term risk-adjusted returns. They are the ones that position the organization most advantageously for the environment that will exist in 10 or 15 years. That positioning requires making investments that produce no visible return for years, relationships that take a decade to become commercially meaningful, jurisdictional presence that costs significant operational resources before it generates significant strategic advantage, Regulatory engagement that consumes time and expertise with no guarantee that the engagement will produce the policy environment being cultivated toward. Most organizations cannot sustain that kind of investment. The pressure of near-term performance, from investors, from boards, from the internal cultures of organizations that measure themselves against quarterly benchmarks, prevents the patience that the long-horizon positioning requires. The family office structure is specifically immune to that pressure. There are no outside investors to satisfy, no board demanding quarterly returns, no public market assigning a valuation that shifts with each data point. There is only the family, and the family's timeline is generational. That immunity is not incidental to the strategy. It is the strategy's most important structural feature. The freedom to be patient is not a luxury. It is the primary competitive advantage. And Singapore built a jurisdiction specifically designed to protect it. The network is the asset. In Singapore, this is understood with a clarity and an operational precision that most financial cultures only approximate. Every serious financial center produces networks. New York has its alumni associations and its industry conferences and its dinner circuit. London has its clubs and its country weekends and the specific social infrastructure of a city that has been organizing elite relationships for centuries. Hong Kong had, before the political environment changed its character, the specific, cosmopolitan intensity of a hub city where relationships formed quickly and capital moved accordingly. Singapore's networks are different in a specific way that takes time to see clearly, but that, once seen, explains a significant portion of the financial center's sustained competitive advantage. They are designed to be stable across political cycles. This is not a natural property of financial networks. Most networks are, in practice, highly sensitive to political conditions, to who is in government, whose relationships with which officials are currently valuable, and whose access to the decision-making processes of consequential institutions is currently functioning. When the political environment changes, the network's value proposition changes with it. The people who were connected to the right people are suddenly connected to the wrong people. The access that justified the relationship no longer accesses the right things. Singapore's elite solved this problem through a form of relationship architecture that distributes political exposure across multiple parties, multiple institutional relationships, and multiple generations of connection, so that no single political transition can simultaneously disrupt every relevant relationship in the network. The family that has been supporting the same university, the same cultural institution, and the same community organizations for 3 generations has relationships with every political configuration that has governed Singapore in that period. Not because they played both sides, that is a different and more dangerous game. Because genuine, long-term community investment produces relationships that survive political change, because the investment is valued by whoever is in power, and because the people making the investment are perceived, correctly, as being oriented toward Singapore's long-term success, rather than toward any particular political outcome within it. That perception, of being genuinely invested in the jurisdiction, rather than simply extracting value from it, is worth more than any specific political relationship at any specific moment. And it is worth exponentially more over a 30-year horizon than any shorter-term strategy that optimizes for access within the current political configuration. Here is where the network produces its most consequential advantage, the one that no financial analysis captures cleanly. Information asymmetry. The Singapore billionaire who has spent 20 years building and maintaining relationships across the region's most consequential financial, political, and commercial institutions does not simply have more relationships than their competitors. They have access to a quality of information that the formal financial system does not produce and cannot produce, because the information flows through relationships rather than through disclosures, through conversations rather than through filings, through the ambient intelligence of a trusted network rather than through any channel that compliance departments can monitor or regulators can require. A regulatory development that will reshape a specific market segment in 18 months. A significant family whose succession planning is creating pressure to monetize assets that have been held for a generation. A political shift in a regional government that will change the investment environment for a specific category of asset in ways that the current pricing does not reflect. None of this is insider information in the legal sense. None of it is exchanged through any channel that creates legal exposure. It is simply the natural output of being trusted by the right people at the right moments, of having been present, reliable, and genuinely useful across enough relationships for long enough that important information arrives as a matter of course. The edge is not analysis. It is not superior modeling or faster data processing or more sophisticated quantitative frameworks. It is the specific, irreplaceable, non-algorithmic intelligence that flows between human beings who trust each other in contexts where the trust was earned over years of demonstrated reliability. No technology replicates this. No database contains it. No fund without the relationships can buy access to it at any price. And the Singapore elite have been building the relationships that generate it since before most of their current competitors entered the market. That head start is not narrowing. It is compounding. Everything we have examined, the silence, the patience, the network architecture, the information advantage, is how the Singapore elite protect and grow what they have built. But there is a dimension of the strategy that operates beyond finance entirely. A dimension that shapes the next generation of this city's dominance in ways that most analysis never reaches. What comes next is where the real long game lives. Here is the reversal that changes the frame entirely. The Singapore billionaires' most significant investment is not in the market. It is not in a sector, a fund structure, a geographic position, or any of the financial instruments through which the accumulation of wealth is conventionally measured and discussed. Their most significant investment, the one that produces the highest long-term return, the one that the most sophisticated among them allocate the most deliberate attention to, is in the formation of the people who will carry the strategy forward when the current generation can no longer carry it themselves. This is the dimension of the Singapore model that Western financial analysis consistently underestimates. Not because it is hidden, it is visible to anyone who spends enough time inside the world to observe what the most serious families actually prioritize, but because it operates on a timeline that produces no visible return within any horizon that external analysis typically considers, and because it involves a form of investment in human beings, in their formation, in their values and judgment and relational capacity that does not map cleanly onto any financial category. The child of a serious Singapore family is not raised to be wealthy. They are raised to be capable of managing wealth on behalf of something larger than themselves. The distinction is fundamental, and it produces outcomes that are, across generations, almost entirely different from the outcomes produced by raising children to be wealthy. Raising children to be wealthy produces people who know how to consume. Raising children to be capable of managing wealth on behalf of something larger produces people who know how to sustain, who understand, at a level that is not intellectual but habitual, the difference between the resources available to them and the resources that belong to them, and who carry, as a lived reality rather than a stated value, the obligation to return the structure to the next generation in at least the condition in which they received it. That obligation, felt genuinely, not performed, is the most valuable thing a family of serious wealth can transmit, more valuable than the capital itself. Because capital, without the orientation that sustains it, is consumed within a generation. With the orientation, it compounds indefinitely. Singapore's most enduring families have solved the transmission problem in a way that most dynastic wealth structures in other parts of the world have not. Not perfectly, no family has solved it perfectly, and the failures within the Singapore elite are as real as the successes, just less visible, but with a consistency that reflects something specific about the cultural and institutional environment in which the transmission is occurring. The educational infrastructure of Singapore, the specific combination of institutional rigor, multicultural competency, and the particular form of disciplined ambition that the system produces, creates a formation environment for the children of the elite that is simultaneously globally competitive and locally grounded. The child who goes through that system, supplemented by the specific additional formation that a serious family provides, the international exposure, the language depth, the early introduction to real professional environments, the relationships cultivated through the family's network, emerges with a range of capability and a quality of judgment that is genuinely rare. And rare capability, introduced into the family's existing structural advantage, produces compounding that no purely financial strategy can match. Now watch how this generational investment extends into the specific domain where Singapore's elite have been most deliberately constructing advantage for the next cycle of the regional economy, technology. Not as a sector to invest in, that is obvious and crowded, as an infrastructure to own. The Singapore families who understood, a decade ago, that the next generation of regional economic power would be organized around digital infrastructure, data flows, and the specific platforms through which the rapidly expanding consumer economies of Southeast Asia would conduct their commercial lives, those families made investments that were not legible as financial decisions at the time. They were relationships, institutional positions, early presence in the ecosystems that have since become the most consequential commercial environments in the region. The investment thesis was not quantitative, it was relational. Identify the people building the infrastructure of the next economy. Build genuine relationships with them, not transactional relationships, but the kind that involve genuine support, genuine engagement with the problem being solved, genuine investment of credibility alongside capital. And be present, reliably and substantively, at every stage of development where presence matters. This is patient capital in its most sophisticated form, not the patient capital that simply waits for a better entry price. The patient capital that is building the relationship through which the entry happens privately, at a stage before any public market exists to set a price, at a valuation that reflects early-stage risk rather than proven trajectory premium. The return on that kind of patience, measured across the families that have practiced it consistently, is the reason the Singapore wealth concentration continues to deepen, while external observers keep predicting the disruption that has not arrived. The disruption never arrives when the people who would be disrupted are also the people funding the disruptors. There is a quality that runs through every conversation with the people who have genuinely built and sustained serious wealth in Singapore, and that is almost never mentioned in any profile, any interview, or any of the occasional glimpses that the financial press gets of this world. The quality is equanimity, not the performed calm of someone managing their public presentation, not the strategic composure of a person who has learned to conceal their reactions in professional settings. Something more fundamental than either, the genuine, habituated, deeply internalized orientation toward outcome that comes from having operated at altitude for long enough to understand, at a visceral level, what is actually controllable and what is not. The Singapore elite do not catastrophize. They do not celebrate excessively. They do not allow the volatility of markets, of political environments, of the specific crises that every generation of serious wealth navigates, to produce volatility in their own judgment or their own decision-making. This is not because they are not affected by what happens. They are affected. The losses are real, the pressures are real, and the stakes, measured in terms of what a single wrong decision can cost across a generational structure, are genuinely high. But equanimity is the product of something specific. It is the product of having a framework, a clear, tested, internally coherent understanding of what the strategy is, why it is the right strategy, and what the indicators would be that the strategy needed to change. A framework that was not assembled in response to the current crisis, which is why it does not collapse under the current crisis's specific pressure, but built over years, through experience, through the accumulated judgment of people who faced different crises with the same framework and found it held. That framework is the most transferable thing in this video, not the specific tactics, the family office structure, the network architecture, the generational investment strategy. Those are Singapore-specific in their execution, and their replication in different jurisdictions would require adaptation that goes beyond the scope of what is being described here. But the framework beneath the tactics, the orientation toward time, toward silence, toward the patient construction of structural advantage over immediate transactional gain, that framework is not jurisdiction-specific. It is a way of thinking about wealth and power that produces consistent results across every environment where it has been applied with discipline and patience. The first element of the framework is the longest horizon available, not the longest horizon you are comfortable with, the longest one that is operationally relevant to the decisions being made. Most people make financial decisions on a horizon that matches their own life expectancy, or their career expectancy, or the time frame within which they expect to be accountable for the outcome. The Singapore elite make decisions on a horizon that extends past their own lives, into the lives of people who do not yet exist, whose interests they are obligated to represent as fully as their own. That extension of the decision horizon changes every calculation. It changes which risks are acceptable, which returns are sufficient, which relationships deserve investment, and which short-term opportunities should be declined because their cost, measured on the longer timeline, exceeds what the headline return justifies. The second element is the consistent prioritization of position over performance. Not the position of being seen as successful, the position of being structurally advantaged in the next round of whatever game is being played. Performance is backward-looking, it measures what happened. The position is forward-looking, it determines what can happen. The Singapore elite invest in position constantly, even when, especially when, the investment in position comes at the cost of near-term performance. The third element is the maintenance of silence as a competitive asset, not as a personality trait, as a deliberate, continuously chosen, operationally rational decision to deny competitors the information about your position that would allow them to respond to it effectively. Every public statement is a disclosure, every visible move is a signal. Every profile in a financial publication is a map, handed freely to everyone who might use it, of the territory you have worked years to understand and occupy. The Singapore elite do not hand out maps. They move quietly, build patiently, and allow the results, visible only in retrospect, only to people who are already inside the circle where the results are meaningful, to speak in the only register that has ever mattered to them. Not the market's register, not the media's register, not the register of public opinion or cultural recognition, or the specific form of validation that visibility provides to people who still need it. The register of the people whose respect they built the whole thing to deserve. That audience is small, their assessment is honest. And earning it, not performing for it, earning it, is the only metric the Singapore elite have ever truly kept score by. Everything else was just work. Luxury power exists for one reason only: to reveal what the elite pay to hide. Subscribe to Luxury Power and hit the bell now. Every week a new secret is uncovered. Drop in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing our global audience. Everything you saw here is based on real cases, verified contracts, and documented facts. We don't glorify wealth, we dissect it. Do you still think money buys freedom? Tell us in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to see the truth. And remember, even the most expensive life can be a gilded cage. See you in the next video.